Welcome back to the Theology of the Buddy podcast, a podcast for Catholics who love tradition and want more of it. This is episode 41. My name is Chris, and I'm joined by my magnanimous co-host, Michael Strauss. How's it going, man?
That's very generous of you.
How are you, my friend?
Doing great.
Yeah.
Back to do another podcast and discuss our favorite topic, the liturgy.
Halo. Wait.
Oh. The process of getting halos.
Yeah. Or the process of getting a perfection on Guardian in Halo 3.
Yeah. The way of perfection, you might call it.
If anybody's played Halo, they'll understand. If you don't, we'll just say it's almost as difficult as getting a real Halo. Maybe, well, for me.
Depends on who you're playing against.
Too funny. So, in this podcast, we're continuing our response to the two Catholic dudes who had a podcast discussing the Novus Ordo and the traditional Latin Mass. They claim it's a both and thing as a Catholic, and we're responding to that. So if you haven't heard that, we recommend you go back one episode. You can find it at theologyofthebuddy.com, or you can find us on Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, wherever, and listen to that. That's episode 40.
Yeah. So we addressed some of the points in their video in our last podcast, and we're kind of going through some of the big ones that we didn't get to because there's really a lot to talk about. And just to reiterate, we're trying to be very constructive in our any criticism there is. We're really trying to just bring the trad perspective to it because these guys, they set out to kind of respond to some things people were saying online. Some people are trolling and being haters as always. And people are making lots of memes. And as I said in the last episode, don't take this as a attack on the two Catholic dudes, but they haven't been to the Latin Mass before and they don't know much about it. That wasn't really the point of their podcast to research the Latin Mass or anything, but they talked a lot about it, and we thought a lot of the things they're talking about could really use some trad perspective. Mm-hmm. We talked in the last episode about how we've both been on a long journey to our current place where we are in the faith and going to the traditional Latin Mass. And we have, or past selves of us especially, had a lot in common with these two guys. So here we are, and we're going to speak to perhaps the most personal and the most emotional issue in their podcast, which is the topic of liturgical music. And for us, it was really emotional too. Mm-hmm. We were both music ministers, and we loved it. We, God worked through us in that too. And we talked a lot about this in the last episode in our story, so I don't want to repeat everything, but I think we understand a lot of the emotion, so we'll try extra hard to make our points without making them want to kill us.
Yeah, maybe.
What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, maybe to begin, I can share a little story. So I don't know if you're familiar with the recent release of a Christian rapper by the name of John Rubin. And he's named his newest EP release Greatest Christian Rapper Ever. And I got to tell you, have you listened to it yet, Mike?
No, not at all.
Have you ever listened to John Rubin?
I think I have, but not a lot.
Okay. So I grew up like listening to John Rubin, and this little EP that he released, I thought was absolute gold. And one of my favorite lines there's a song called Secular Music, and he says in the song, "And I was always there for you when you couldn't listen to secular music." And and it's true.
That's great.
It's true. And so when he said greatest Christian rapper ever, I had to admit that he was right. He is. And I, as a former Christian rapper, am conceding the crown to him.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Hold the phone,
Yes.
former Christian rapper.
Yes. I don't know
Trad
if
Catholic Chris.
Yeah. And not
Wow.
only Christian rapper, but wait for it, liturgical rapper. That's right. You heard it here, folks. Liturgical rapper.
Boo.
But hold on. It was to the Psalms. Okay. It was a responsorial psalm, and it was very popular. People really liked it.
Yeah.
You might call it religious popular music.
You could, absolutely. And I have to admit, while we're doing confessions live on the podcast, I wasn't there at this mass, but I distinctly remember when Chris told me about this psalm that he rapped to at mass. My response at the time was like, "Oh man, that's the coolest thing ever. Like, we should totally do that again."
Yeah. And you know who inspired it? You know who inspired it? Father Stan Fortuna, right?
Oh,
Greatest priestly rapper ever. You know?
yeah. Not a lot of competition for that, but yeah.
So, well, I don't know. Maybe I'd take that back. Father Pontifex he's pretty good in terms of rap, but anyway, so it was inspired by Father Stan, a rap that Father Stan had done in his, what was it? Sacrosongs 2, because he couldn't come up with a better title, apparently.
Sacrosongs 2, Sacrosong harder.
Yeah. Anyway, but that's the thing, I rapped a psalm, and the entire congregation loved it, and the powers that be that were helping me musically in that parish, they thought it was a beautiful thing too. And I'll be honest with you, I'm still to this day, like, I still deal with the guilt from that. So anyway, like, yeah, I don't know if we kind of want to get into it, but music is such an important thing, and it's been such an important thing for us as friends. And I think that's part of the reason why the Latin Mass has had such an impact on us too. It's also the musical beauty of it that has captivated us.
Yeah, it definitely has. In our high mass, like, we have some good music, and I mean, we can toot our own horn and say, we're in the Scola, but on Sundays, it's not us. Yeah. We're just in the pews like regular Catholics, and actively participating in the ordinary manner. Yes. Did we get to that topic yet?
Not yet.
Premature shots fired. But anyways, Yeah, we have good music. We like it. Yeah. But let's actually get back to the topic at hand. So pointing out that Chris did this rap is kind of like an extreme way to illustrate that exactly the argument that these two dudes have, reading the church documents. I think it's Musicum Sacrum that they're focusing on. We, to some degree, were aware of parts of this, but
I was completely aware of it. I was completely aware of it.
And back then we had a similar understanding, I would say a faulty understanding of those documents at that time.
Yeah. And for the record, I would say, like, just to give us maybe a little mercy here at the same time, like,
no mercy. What do you think this is, a Christian podcast?
Who do you think I am? Pope Francis? No. The thing is, like, the people that were teaching people like me were handing me these documents and saying, hey, check this out, and giving me their own spin on it. And so when I was hearing this, and I was like, well, you guys are the experts. You guys are the ones that know better than me. I'm just a teenager. At that point, I was, 18, 19, like bordering 20. So, like, I don't know. Like, so at the same time, like, yeah, I was given documents and things like that, but it was, you don't really know until you start really digging into, like, once you get a fuller understanding of even the documents of the Second Vatican Council as a whole, only then can you really understand and interpret those pieces.
Yeah, and even like a sense of the greater liturgical tradition of the church. The documents are written in such a way that some of that tradition is often assumed. And when you're looking at some of these choice quotes from Musicum Sanctum and Sacrosanctum Concilium, it's very easy as a layperson who doesn't have a lot of background knowledge to read it and say, okay, what I'm doing is allowed and it's totally fine. Because it is vague enough that it's easy to read it as everything is allowed, no matter what.
Well, maybe not everything, but everything that has a religious kind of feel to it, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, you can set some boundaries. Like, I mean, we got to give the dudes credit for saying, of course, they're not going to put in songs with like heresy and,
right.
Protestant theology and stuff like that. And honestly, that puts them ahead of a lot of Catholic music ministries. So props for that. But stuff like that isn't explicit even in the documents. It's just assumed, right?
Right.
Like, it's kind of like common sense. Of course, you don't sing songs with heretical lyrics at Mass, but it's vague enough that people can read it and still say, well, I like this song, so I'm going to sing it anyway. It doesn't specifically say I can't sing folk songs. So why can't I play this Marty Hagen song, even though it's completely heretical?
Right.
Just to pick on one example, because Marty Hagen deserves to be picked on.
All day, every day.
Yeah. And I'm sure the two Catholic dudes are not playing Marty Hagen.
No.
Yeah.
For sure.
But if you are, shame on you. Oops, sorry. I'll go back to being charitable now. So can I want to kind of dive into some of the quotes from the dudes and discuss kind of how I reacted to them.
Okay.
the start of this topic, and well, one of the things they said towards the beginning where I was kind of like, oh boy, it's getting spicy right off the top. Because I think the quote they said was, yeah, your whole passion for the Lord and serving him, get that out of here. That was the quote. It was basically like, the implication is, if you're saying that modern praise and worship music isn't appropriate for Mass, that's what you're saying to that music minister is, get your passion for the Lord out of here. You can't serve the Lord. And I would say I do kind of understand the defensiveness and the feeling behind it, but it's definitely a fallacy, right?
Yeah.
It's definitely a fallacy to say that if something doesn't belong in the Mass, it's being disrespected or unfairly suppressed, or that it can't be used to serve the Lord or the church in other ways.
Yes.
And something that kind of jumped out at me too is that kind of gut reaction to things in the Mass is pretty common outside of music as well.
Yes.
You kind of get if I can't play guitar at Mass, I'm being excluded, but you also get, if I can't read the readings at Mass, I'm being excluded. If I can't preach at Mass, I'm being excluded. If I can't distribute Holy Communion, I'm being excluded. If I can't be a priest, even though I'm a woman or I'm a married man, I'm being excluded.
Right. Yeah, it's true. It's true.
There's a lot of that.
That's a really good point.
Like, that's just to point out, it's like, you can serve the Lord in other ways than at Mass. That's just a fact. So it's not logical to say that if that music actually isn't appropriate for Mass, that the gifts that the Lord has given a person who's in music ministry are now useless or wasted, or that, the church doesn't want them or doesn't appreciate them. It's not true.
Yeah. The point you made in the last podcast, to me, that was one of the biggest home runs, if I could say so. Like, that when you try to change the Mass to suit the desires of others, it is not others that you've converted, it's the Mass. And I feel like that applies here too. This is kind of the overarching understanding that Mass doesn't need to fit into these categories of what makes me feel useful, or what in the Mass can properly utilize my gifts, And I think the more you kind of come to grow in your love for the Lord, in your own personal, I'm going to say it, in your own personal relationship with Christ and with the church, the more you realize that the church is far more broad than just simply I think they were even saying this in their podcast kind of as well, that it's much more broad than just the Mass. So your gifts and your talents, those things that God has given you, can fit, but it doesn't have to fit in the context of the liturgy, and I think that's the whole purpose of things like the new evangelization and things like that. Things like the St. Catherine Institute, I think that's what it's called. Kind of figuring out what your charisms and stuff are. Like, it's not simply supposed to be at the service directly of the liturgy. There could be a million other things and a million other ways that your gifts can be utilized. So and that was a hard pill to swallow for me, being like, so my gifts as a worship leader, I can't use those in Mass, but realizing like I can still worship God, like I still find myself picking up my guitar at times, at home or with others, and we'll sing some songs to the Lord. Is that a problem? It would be if the songs were heretical, but I mean, yeah, you can still use those gifts,
Yeah. And especially in the context of, like youth ministry and stuff like that, like you're not working in youth ministry anymore, but
No.
like if you're a youth minister and you're, hanging out with people who are into this kind of music on a regular basis, if you're like having, I don't know, the equivalent of like life nights or whatever,
Yeah.
it's an appropriate place for this kind of thing. Now we've theoretically talked about how like if the music wasn't appropriate for Mass, it wouldn't mean you're excluded, but we haven't actually addressed in the documents and stuff they quoted why or why not like it is or isn't allowed, right? So maybe we should dig in a little deeper to the specific arguments there, because this was the one part where I felt like they had actually done some research, gone and got some sources to back up their position. So it invites a discussion that takes seriously their sources and gives a counterexample or counterargument, right? So the key quote I wanted to read that they brought up was Musicum Sanctum, paragraph 9. And I'll just read that out. It says, "No kind of sacred music is prohibited from liturgical actions by the Church as long as it corresponds to the spirit of the liturgical celebration itself." So keep track of these as long as's, because there's two main parts. Number one, as long as it corresponds to the spirit of the liturgical celebration itself and the nature of its individual parts. And two, and it does not hinder the active participation of the people. Yeah, so that's, those are on face value pretty vague. And you can see how it's very easy to read that and say, oh yeah, like, of course my praise and worship music is completely corresponding to the spirit of the liturgy, and it's not hindering anyone. Everyone's singing and clapping along and doing hand motions and, like riding on the clouds, shining like the sun and stuff. So they're very actively participating, and, it seems like a slam dunk. This praise and worship music is good. But I think we can dig in a little bit more to both of those parts, right?
Yes.
And we'll do that and then go into some of the other documents that kind of provide a counterpoint as well. So the spirit of the liturgy, it's not just a book by Pope Benedict. It's a thing that exists in the church.
Yes.
I think the way to address this idea of like, what is the spirit of the liturgy, and is there an objective way to like analyze if something is corresponding to the spirit of the liturgy, is to go back to the purpose of the Mass. We talked about this a little bit in the part about, is the Mass about me? What is it about? We have to remember first and foremost what the Mass is. The sacrifice of the Lord at Calvary, the crucifixion made present. And that's always going to be the foremost element of the Mass and the foremost thing that sets the tone and the I guess, character of the Mass, the spirit of the liturgy, so to speak.
Yeah. Like, if I could add, and maybe you were going to mention this too, one of the things that the two Catholic dudes mentioned was the importance of community, right? And how Mass is not just about the Eucharist itself, like it's not an isolated thing. It also involves the community and whatnot. And while we acknowledge that, the church is the body of Christ, Christ is the head and we are the members. And you are united to him at the Mass. Even if you look at, In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the current catechism, if you look in section 1322 to like 1419, okay, this is kind of the section around the sacrament of the Eucharist. This is in the sacraments part of the catechism. If you look up the word community, okay, it mentions community 3 times. Okay. But if you look up the word sacrifice, it says it 66 times. So that should give us an understanding of kind of the order of things. That yes, we acknowledge that there is that communal element with one another, but it's far down on the list in terms of priorities. You know, we have to understand that sacrifice is the most important part of the Mass.
Yeah, it's kind of a cool illustration, but like I had this in my notes as almost its own topic, but we didn't really get to that. Just the idea that trads don't care about tradition, or they want us to all be in our own bubble, just focusing on ourselves and ignoring everyone else, and, you know, stuff like that. And yeah, it's kind of an unfair characterization. Trads are often pushing back against community and saying, like, you know, this guy's just talking about community. He's so Protestant or so effeminate or whatever, you know, and making memes about, like, you know, all are welcome and stuff like that.
Hand holding at Mass and things like that.
Yeah. And really, it's not, at heart, it's not we hate fellowship and community, or that's bad. It's a pushback against the overemphasis of community, because the Mass is about the sacrifice and worship of God, and like 73 items down the list is, you know, community and fellowship. But for whatever reason, in a lot of Catholic circles, that fellowship is right up at the top and sacrifice is 73 levels down because we're embarrassed about it, because that offends the Protestants or whatever, you know? Yeah. Let me just, this is kind of a tangent, but I have to tell the story. Like, one time in university, a Protestant friend came to Mass with me, and I asked her what she thought after the Mass, and she was like, "Oh, it was beautiful." And I was wondering, like, and I still think this might have been like a talking point, but that's beside the point. She was like, I wonder why he kept saying it was a sacrifice. Wasn't there only one sacrifice? Blah, blah, blah. And we all know, as Catholics, we believe we're making present the one sacrifice of Christ during the Mass. But like, I saw firsthand, it really is a stumbling block to Protestants calling the Mass a sacrifice, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, maybe that's the reason it's 73 notches down in the people who have too much emphasis on ecumenism, I guess. But it is in its proper place. That's what the Mass is about.
Sorry, maybe a side note too. This is also why we see, in terms of documents since the Second Vatican Council, a changing in terminology away from the word altar to table, right? Away from Eucharistic sacrifice to banquet or feast or whatever. If you look, even, I was just doing a little look on the catechism as well. If you look up table, it's mentioned 11 times, but if you look up altar, it's like over 20. But it's still, like, the word table was, you know, only really mentioned with regards to, like, the scriptures prior to Vatican II. The altar was never referred to as a table.
Yeah, it was very rare to use that terminology.
Right.
And, like, primarily it was always, the holy sacrifice of the Mass and, as you said, the altar, like words that reference the sacrificial nature of the Mass were way more common.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know about you, but like when I read the scriptures, you don't really hear about a sacrificial table in the temple. It's just my thought, but
yeah, it's kind of weird. I mean, to some extent, there's an element of it, but again, it's an overemphasis of the role of the table at the Last Supper,
right,
versus the altar of sacrifice, right? It's an overemphasis of one piece of the meaning over and above the one that we either don't want to express or we want to suppress for some reason, something like that.
It's a lack of understanding of even our Eucharistic theology, right? Like that table that was in the upper room with the apostles or whatever, like that table was essentially united to the cross. Like everything that happened at that table was united mystically to the work that Christ would do the following day.
Yeah. In the same way the Mass is, right?
Right. Exactly. It's the same thing.
Yeah. So, yeah, before I forget, let's get back to this quote from Musicum Sanctum. So,
is it Musicum Sanctum or Musicum Sacram?
Oh, I wrote down Sanctum, but maybe, is it Sacrum?
Let me look it up.
One eternity later.
I think it's Musicum Sacram. Yeah, it is. Musicum Sacram.
Okay, well, I'm going to look stupid on the podcast, but I typed it wrong in my notes, so that's just me.
Too bad we can't go back and just force fill every Musicum Sanctum.
Yeah, every time I say it, just have some voice actor who sounds nothing like me just record Sacrum. Or do it with like a robot,
Microsoft
text to speech. Yeah.
Musicum Sacram.
Yeah, so that's kind of exploring the spirit of the liturgy. There's the memeified version. If it doesn't belong at the foot of the cross, it doesn't belong in the Mass. So this is just kind of like to open up a little bit the meaning of the spirit of the liturgy in terms of that. It's not saying anything goes, far from it. There's an actual spirit to the liturgy that is proper to it, that music should correspond to. It's not just the spirit that happens to be there because it's a folk mass. And so, it matches the mood that's there at that time. It's supposed to match the objective spirit of the liturgy. And then the second half of that is, and does not hinder the active participation of the people. So I think we touched on this on our last podcast. Maybe, maybe not. But the guys talked about how active participation can be in the heart, uniting to our prayers to God. But they also kind of talked about it in a sense where like, okay, that's cool if you're an introverted trad and you want to just unite your heart to God, but the rest of us are going to do our thing, and active participation is going to be like singing and blah, blah, blah. I think there's something missing to this understanding of active participation, because while there can be singing and physical movement and stuff, the part that is actually active participation is uniting ourselves to the prayers of the Mass. If that's not there, it's not active participation, even if you're running laps around the church. Physical activity is not active participation. I could be standing there mimicking all the moves the priest does at the Mass, doing my orans pose, holding hands and stuff. But yeah, if I'm not uniting myself inwardly to the prayers of the Mass, I'm not actively participating. So in that understanding, we have to be very careful
Mhm.
because suddenly I'm playing some upbeat praise and worship, some Hillsong or something. Everyone's participating. People are clapping. People are doing hand motions. People are, getting all excited and active. But is this music actually bringing them to unite their hearts with the prayers of the liturgy? Not so sure. So we have to be very careful with this kind of thing, like music that can actually hinder active participation by basically drawing people to actively participate in the music rather than the Mass itself.
Right. Yep. Couldn't agree more. It's funny because like even in both Masses, right, in both the Tridentine and the Novus Ordo, there is the direct command from the priest to lift up your hearts, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't say, lift up your voices, lift up your hands, just lift up your hearts. And he says that even in a low Mass, he says that in a daily Mass in the chapel with no music, that is the heart of active participation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we say it is right and just, right? Like we can say it from our hearts. It is right and just.
Yeah, absolutely, dude. So, maybe I should make sure I actually get the name of this church document right before I move on to the next quote. So hopefully I have this name right, even though I'm probably butchering Latin still. So I have a couple quotes from Sacrosanctum Concilium.
Okay. What is Sacrosanctum Concilium?
That is the Apostolic Constitution on the liturgy, right?
Yep.
From the Second Vatican Council.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's basically Musicum Sacrum, which we quoted from earlier, was a later document that was meant to clarify a couple things in the more authoritative document, which is Sacrosanctum Concilium from Vatican II. Right? I'm
Right.
on base here? Okay.
Yep.
So 2 quotes from Sacrosanctum Concilium. The Dogmatic Constitution on the Liturgy from the Second Vatican Council. Oh, we got that part right. I don't need to repeat that. Okay.
No.
So paragraph 112, it says, the musical tradition of the Universal Church is a treasure of inestimable value, greater even than any other art. So that quote I brought up in our previous podcast, and that just kind of sets the tone for the stakes of anything that changes or sets aside the musical tradition of the church. So essentially it's saying, like, if you're going to exclusively play modern music, watch yourself, because you're setting aside the church's priceless works of art that are greater than any other art that the church has created.
So step aside Michelangelo and like all the great artists of the church. The musical tradition is the real deal in terms of art in the church.
So to put that in perspective, because Gregorian chant is learnable by pretty much anyone. So
it's so
have
easy.
access
Even
to
we
it.
can do it.
Yeah.
And that's saying a lot.
Even us former, modern worship leaders learned Gregorian chant. We're in the Schola now. But this is kind of the metaphor that popped into my head, is like, imagine your diocese has a historic church like Notre Dame, and you decide, Notre Dame's okay. There might be some documents that say it should have pride of place, but we're not going to say Mass there anymore. We're only going to do it in our modern architecture buildings that we made in the last 60 years. Notre Dame can sit there and, be a museum for people to pay to go through, but no more Mass. That would be a crime, right? That would be just offensive to Catholic tradition. Essentially, what this is saying in Sacrosanctum Concilium is that setting aside the Church's treasure of Gregorian chant is even worse than letting a great church like Notre Dame or the Sistine Chapel fall into disuse and never having Mass there. So moving on, 4 paragraphs down, we get the actual quote that addresses Gregorian chant directly, paragraph 116. This is a little bit longer of a quote. I'm just going to read the whole thing. The Church acknowledges Gregorian chant as specially suited to the Roman liturgy. Therefore, other things being equal, it should be given pride of place in liturgical services. But other kinds of sacred music, especially polyphony, are by no means excluded from liturgical celebrations, so long as they accord with the spirit of the liturgical action. So yeah, Gregorian chant is specially suited to the Roman liturgy. No other type of music has that distinction, right? Not just that it's specifically suited to worship itself, but even the Roman liturgy in particular. Like, Eastern Christians have different musical traditions in their divine liturgies, but the Western Church, the Roman liturgy, has always had Gregorian chant. Well, not always, but since Gregory.
Yeah.
Pope Gregory the Great.
If I can maybe add to that too, this is also reiterated in the general instruction for the Roman Missal. The gentleman in the podcast said they didn't know where the list of approved instruments was. That's where you're going to go to find that. Okay. But in section 41, it reiterates again, and this is what priests are required to follow with regards to the liturgy, right? So it mentions that all things being equal, Gregorian chant holds pride of place. Goes on to say in section 41, since faithful from different countries come together ever more frequently, it is fitting that they know how to sing together at least some parts of the ordinary of the Mass in Latin, especially the Creed and the Lord's Prayer, set to the simpler melodies.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about you, but almost every time I go to a different diocese, I have no idea. Like if I'm attending a Novus Ordo Mass, I have no idea what the setting is. Like, no clue. I know what the words are, if I'm in an English-speaking place, but I don't know what the tune is. Whereas in the Latin Mass, whether I'm in St. Thomas, Ontario, Canada, or I'm in Toronto, or I'm in Chicago, or I'm in Detroit, I know what I'm singing.
Yeah, and it's the same even if you're, in Tokyo.
Yeah. If
you can find a Latin Mass over there.
Yeah.
But that's beside the point.
You can. But it's crazy. Like,
yeah.
And how, I don't know about you, but that in particular, that experience for me has been incredibly freeing. That I go to a high Mass wherever, if it's in the extraordinary form or the traditional Latin Mass, and I'm like, yeah, I know what I'm doing. I know where I'm at, and I can actually participate,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, you can follow the Mass a lot better, right? Like that active participation doesn't necessarily require you to know the words or the tune or anything like that, but it's nice.
Yeah. I was watching a video recently of the American bishops that had their ad limina visit with the Holy Father. Mm-hmm. And, so they're in Rome, they're all together. Bishop Strickland was among them. And, and it shows them in, I don't know which crypt it was, but they were singing And what were they singing? Credo 3. They all know it.
Yeah.
You know.
And you know what? Maybe I'm judging unfairly, but most Catholics in the world, and probably the dudes from Two Catholic Dudes podcast, are like, Credo 3? I thought there was only one creed. Or, well, two, the Apostles and Nicene Creed.
Yeah.
But we're talking about the third musical setting of the Nicene Creed.
Yeah.
At Mass.
Yeah. No, I just find it interesting, and the fact that in Rome, they still, even with their Novus Ordos, I mean, if you're looking for the unicorn Novus Ordo, they're pretty much it in a big way. But yeah, they follow the Latin responses there. You know, in the Vatican, they still do that.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to note, it's pretty obvious in that quote and in the general instruction that Gregorian chant is supposed to have pride of place. We'll come back to that and hammer it even more, probably. But I wanted to note in that quote from Sacrosanctum Concilium that sacred polyphony is actually singled out and basically given a second place position after Gregorian chant.
Yeah.
And in your modern Novus Ordo, and especially your youth mass, polyphony is just as non-existent as Gregorian chant. And maybe it's just me, but I wasn't able to find any ranking of where Hillsong or Hagenhaz fits on the list. Like, are they like number 3 after polyphony, or, you know, I don't know. It's not specified.
No. And again, like, if the church didn't mean it, she, you know, like they say, like with regards to scripture, like if Jesus repeats it multiple times, he means it. And it's the same with the church, right? So if she says it in Sacrosanctum Concilium, and then in the general instruction of the Roman Missal says again, other types of sacred music, in particular, polyphony, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, they're not being metaphorical. It's just like John 6.
Yeah.
They're saying it again and again because they literally want you to sing Gregorian chant at Mass. Mm-hmm. And to some people, that might be as offensive as, how can this man give us his flesh to eat?
It's true. It's true. Because
it's true. This is a hard teaching. Who can accept it?
Yeah. It's legitimately tough to learn polyphony, and it's legitimately tough to learn Gregorian chant, especially if you're used to G, C, D, E minor, capo 6.
Yeah.
Like,
let's charitably assume that these guys have more skill than that, but still.
Well, yeah. I mean, jacked youth minister dude's ripping on his Gibson FG, so like,
yeah.
Anyway, yeah. But that's the thing. It is a difficult thing, even practically speaking, even for a music leader to be like, okay, choir, let's do this. We're gonna change it up a little bit. But to me, the question is, and again, this was a gut check for me, is, am I going to give him my best or my third best? Mm-hmm. Am I going to be obedient to the church he founded? Because this is what she asks. You know, the boys and the Catholic dudes said, you know, well, all of this is allowed. But not only is it allowed, like they have made specifications and they've said, but this is important. This is what needs to happen. This needs to be given pride of place, right? But
yeah, I mean, it's a question that has to be asked, right? Like, it's kind of a confrontational way of saying it, I guess. But if you're quoting these documents and you believe they are authoritative and need to be followed, ask yourself why Gregorian chant doesn't have pride of place in your parish or in your mass.
Or generally. I mean, we don't know how and what their Mass is like. But I mean, I can speak in particular to, I know what his Psalm responses are like, because he shares those on Instagram. And man, Ryan, talented as all get out, man. That guy he's got a stellar voice, and he's incredibly talented at the piano, like just amazing. But I don't see him doing, okay, this week we're going to share our Gregorian chant we've been working on,
So take that as a challenge. Maybe we can move on from the music topic now.
Yeah, now that we're an hour and 5 minutes in.
Yeah. We can kind of quickly address the other issues, I think.
Yeah, pretty quick.
Yeah. So maybe I'll talk about the mic drop argument.
Yes.
That's kind of a quick one to...
We just public service announcement. We don't believe in dropping Mike. He's here to stay.
Aw, thanks, dude. I appreciate that.
Also, if you want to drop Mike, though, just for the record, do it from a really high up. He will love it.
It's not true.
Mike is scared of heights.
Yeah, my secret's out and I'm afraid of heights. So, yeah, this is just like a quick one to respond to. The two Catholic dudes mentioned that's always the mic drop argument, right? The fact that Jesus is present at the Mass. And the consecration is valid. It's a Mass. And that informs a lot of things, like saying, like, you can't say you hate the Novus Ordo. You can't, say it's not as good as the traditional Latin Mass, even because Jesus is there. How can you say it's not as good? On some level, yeah, it makes sense because the sacrifice of Jesus is one and the same. And that part has an objective quality that cannot be greater or lesser. But that's not the entirety of the parts of the Mass, right? And I would say to answer it to answer it like St. Thomas, I would say, on the contrary, the true presence is actually why inadequate liturgy is even more worthy of criticism, right? Because our Lord is truly present, even the tiniest defect or imperfection or something that's not quite as good in the Mass is a serious issue. Even if, one of the least important parts of the Mass is changed and made worse, that's terrible. This is our Lord we're talking about, the most important and highest worship of God who's truly present. That's why when you see the vast amount of changes and the vast array of ways the liturgy was cut up and made worse, it makes sense to say this liturgy is worse. And even I hate the fact that it was made worse. I hate the way it is because these things could be better and our Lord deserves them to be better. Mm-hmm. So that's the perspective there from me. Like, it probably sounds like trads are just being insane, mean trolls if they say something like that. But there is a perspective behind it, I think, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And coming back to what we were saying in the previous episode, any trad that's worth their salt, okay, will admit to you that the reason why they may, quote unquote, hate the Novus Ordo or dislike the Novus Ordo is because they love him. They love Christ. It's driven by that. Again, when you have someone in your life, and this applies even just at a human level, when you have someone in your life that you love, you want the best for them. I just had, my wife just gave birth to our third child, my first here on the earth. And like, John is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And I would tear down heaven if I could to give it to him. Like, that's how much I love him. But like, my love for God should logically be more. And like, if I see him being mistreated and abused, as we've talked about the abuses with regards to communion in the hand and the particles and stuff. When you see that kind of stuff, you go like, yeah, this is not good. And I want to see him loved, not mistreated. So anyway, that's just my side note. But I just, again, we need to keep that mindset that trads love Jesus. We do.
Yeah. That's why we love tradition.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
What else should we talk about before we run out of time? Do you want to do the, I want to talk about the councils thing.
Yes.
Real quick.
Yeah.
If anything at all was wrong with the liturgy, they'd just call a council and they'd fix it. Just like they did with the English translations. There's many things to note here. First of all, the example of the English translations. A lot of the examples they gave as stuff that was allowed before was actually never allowed. Like just making up arbitrary lyrics to the Lamb of God.
The Agnus Dei. Thanks,
Dei.
Matt Maher. Just saying, right?
That was a straight up liturgical abuse, Matt Maher.
A liturgical oof.
Yep. But yeah, that actually illustrates the exact opposite, because the English translation of the Mass was obviously terribly defective, and it took 50 years for them to correct it. 50 years. Do I even need to, okay, let's continue the argument against this, because there's one other point. We know there are bishops, and many of them, that are doing a bad job at very important things. To me, when I hear if there was something wrong, they would obviously correct it right away, it sounds as crazy as saying if a priest was abusing a kid, they would obviously stop it right away. Or, if the Vatican Bank was laundering funds, they would obviously correct it right away. Or if they'd
have to call a council. But they could just do that. They could just call all the bishops to Rome for a formal council to rectify these issues, because that's how they do it, right?
And I mean, it's just ridiculous. That's just not how anything works.
Yeah. No.
I mean, the crisis of the liturgy is an issue that's worthy of calling a council to correct, but it hasn't been done. And in fact, the last time they called a council was when they caused the problem. So I don't know. But yeah, it just makes no sense.
No.
Oh, the other thing they said about councils that I wanted to reply to was that's why we have councils, because times change. Oof, man.
Yeah. Not a proper understanding of how the church has used councils in the past.
Yeah, councils have always been to clarify the faith against a common heresy. Or has there even really been a reason other than that?
Like Trent was in response to the Protestant Reformation, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Council of Jerusalem was to respond to the Gentile thing, right?
Yeah.
So they weren't ever changing really anything that the church believed.
Yeah, it's quite the opposite, right? They never called a council to adapt to the times. They called a council to harden the church against the times. They called a council to rebuke the heresy of the times and specify things and make dogmatic pronouncements to crush these heresies.
Yeah. It also needs to be stated, just because we're trads, that the Second Vatican Council was not dogmatic in its nature. But that's just...
didn't make any dogmatic statements.
Yeah.
They have a specific formula, which you can see in basically all the other councils. Right?
Yeah.
Right. So, hey, do you want to do the walking out of Mass story? Just
Sure.
to like end with a slam dunk?
Sure.
Or, I don't know, maybe it's not a slam dunk, just a story.
So maybe we can kind of put a couple things together. Right. So one of the things that was said was that the guys were talking about, one of the things that they had seen mentioned to them in memes and things were things like the Novus Ordo sends people to hell. The Latin Mass has less sinners. Anyway, things like that. So again, context is really important. So in my example, this was probably, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. Maybe. Yeah. And at that time, I was noticing like my family and I had begun kneeling to receive the Eucharist on the tongue. Now, we were attending a Novus Ordo parish in our diocese, and we were attending there every week. And the priest at every Mass that we would go to, when he was distributing Holy Communion, when we would get up to him and kneel to receive, we weren't causing a scene. We weren't doing anything. We just, knelt down real quick to receive on the tongue. He would take the host and shove it in our mouth and say, "Body of Christ, no need to kneel." And we'd get up and go back to our seat. And this was happening week after week after week. And this was the good parish. Okay. This was the quote unquote, most traditional parish in the area. And we then attended the Mass on Corpus Christi, on the Feast of Corpus Christi, in the new calendar. And we were sitting there, and during the homily, the priest says essentially that all Eucharistic piety, traditional Eucharistic piety, is worthless. The church has moved away from that. It does not deserve this. We're adults. And so kneeling, Eucharistic adoration, these things, get rid of them. We don't need them anymore. The church has moved on. At that point, after weeks of having the Eucharist shoved in our mouths and being scolded in the communion line, and now hearing that our Lord doesn't deserve to receive any forms of piety, we stood up and left. Was I abandoning our Lord? No. I went to Mass later that night at another parish, at a Life-Teton parish, actually. It was a lot more difficult than I realized it would be. But yeah, again, it's because we love our Lord that we protest those kinds of things. I'm not saying just get up at the drop of a hat, but if there is something sacrilegious being said or something blasphemous being said, leave. You have no obligation to stay at that Mass, especially if you are, if you have options to go to another Mass elsewhere. So,
yeah, notwithstanding the obligation to attend Mass in general,
right?
You don't have any obligation to stay at that particular Mass,
right?
Yeah, and it can be an important witness to not sit and accept a blasphemy like that from the pulpit, I think.
Yeah.
I've never been in that situation where I've felt I had to do that, but I've never heard something as terrible as that.
No.
From the pulpit at a Mass.
And frankly, if you have kind of a traditional understanding of the liturgy, the homily is not part of the Mass. So like I've heard it said, you can stand up and protest verbally at that point, because it's not technically the Mass. You know, it's the in between. I mean, I don't necessarily encourage that because they don't listen that way. They never do.
Yeah.
I recommend speaking to the priest one-on-one afterwards via phone, or have a meeting with him. If he doesn't listen, call the bishop. You know, like that's all you can do.
I know you said it kind of quickly, but the thing about the homily technically being outside of the Mass was kind of a mind-blowing thing, and I didn't know about that until very recently.
That's why
it's kind of a minor detail, but
yeah, we mentioned that in the liturgical breakdown, how when the priest removes the maniple, right, that's a sign that Mass is on hold. Actually, and another clarification too, maybe I'll throw this into the actual liturgical breakdown too, is that in the pre-55 missal, the actual chasuble is taken off and laid on the altar. And then the priest gives his homily, and then he comes back and puts it back on. Yeah.
Oh. I mean, that totally makes it really obvious that the Mass is on hold.
Yeah. Neat, eh?
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, at the end of the day, we hope that this is kind of just a starting point for consideration for you gentlemen, and for anyone who thinks that the Novus Ordo and the Latin Mass are equal in dignity.
Equal in quality.
Equal in quality, yeah.
That it's a both and kind of thing.
Yeah.
It should be discussed, and like it needs to be discussed honestly and with clarity, and also with charity, and also with clarity. That's what I meant to say. Not just with memes, although I love laughing at a good meme. Like, yeah, you can kind of like laugh at dunking on the other side with a meme, but that's not how you discuss and get to the truth, right? We have to lay out the logic behind these positions and actually examine it. So
yeah. And I would say take the time to go to the Latin Mass, go to the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, take some time away from the Novus Ordo to be able to see the difference. And I understand that might be difficult, especially if you're employed as a weekly worship leader at a parish, but you won't regret it. And take the time to do the research on your own and read scholarly works. We heard you talk about Taylor Marshall and Timothy Gordon. If that's not your cup of tea, fine. They're not the face of traditionalism. Okay? They're not. The Mass is the face of traditionalism. So let that speak for itself.
Our Lord is the face of traditionalism.
Yeah.
Deal with it.
Yeah. And look up, I would say, check out people like Dr. Peter Kwasniewski. He's got a lot of fantastic talks on YouTube and on SoundCloud and things like that. A fantastic book is Noble Beauty, Transcendent Holiness. Why the new evangelization needs the Mass of the Ages. A fantastic book. Like just a slam dunk book. You know,
everything's becoming a slam dunk now since we talked about the slam dunk valid consecration thing.
Yeah.
We need some new metaphors. If only we knew things about sports.
Yeah. Make a goal, you're in a basket. Go, my favorite sports team, go. Yeah. Do you have any other recommendations for things for people who may kind of want to get their feet wet and just kind of see what the hype is about?
Just to find out about the Latin Mass. The book I'm using for liturgical breakdown is pretty good for going through the parts of the Mass and the meaning behind them. this is a pre-Vatican II just book about the Mass. So it's not about comparing. It's just a book about the meaning of the Mass and its parts. But it really does show a lot of stuff that's been forgotten about the Mass. This is Monsignor Moorman's The Latin Mass Explained. That's the title it's published under now. It was previously I think it was just The Mass Explained. But yeah.
There's another book right now that's really popular, which is called Treasure and Tradition. I don't know if you've seen much about that book, but it's actually a cool story. There was a lady who, one of the people that made it, decided that during, I don't know what it was, like some synod recently in Rome, that she would go and she would have printed like 3,000 copies of this book, which is all about the traditional Latin Mass. She changed the title to it, but it's the same stuff on the inside. And she went to Rome, her and this other lady, and distributed this book all over Rome during this synod. And like, yeah, I mean, people are so passionate about this, and the numbers don't lie. You know, the number of vocations is through the roof in traditional seminaries. The number of vocations coming out of traditional parishes are like exponentially higher than in Novus Ordo parishes. Yeah, like the number of young families that are coming in, much higher. There was that survey that was done, and it showed like, you know, the number of Catholics that don't use contraception. Yeah, it's staggering. And
yeah, to some extent in our current climate of the church, you can have the devil's advocate argument that someone who takes the faith seriously enough to seek out a Latin Mass is probably going to be someone who's practicing all the moral teachings of the faith. But I do think there is an element of the faith being taught and expressed better in its traditional liturgies too. So,
yeah. And not all traditional Catholics are part of the SSBX, just for the record. If you think that, some people do, or think that we're sedevacantists and think that the Holy Father Pope Francis is not the current reigning pontiff, or that we're sedebeneplenists or benevacantists, as it's wrongfully called.
Those are all real things, but they're not us.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
Take time to look it up. Like, don't take our word for it. Come and see.
We're just two Catholic dudes, so don't trust us.
Yeah. True. Come and see.
Anyways. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Mike, tell us where the good people can find us.
Yeah. So, Instagram, Theology of the Buddy, and Facebook, also Theology of the Buddy. And then our weird sibling in the social media family is Twitter @TradFriends, because Theology of the Buddy is too long for Twitter. Wah, wah.
Wah, wah. Yep.
Yeah.
So,
follow us and let us know what you think about our episodes, because we'd love to chat with you.
for sure. Big shout out goes out to the Thomasian Crusader, who shared out our Aspergus May podcast earlier this week. And a lot of people came over from their side to check us out, and we really appreciated that. So Thomasian Crusader, whoever you are, we love you. And keep the anime trad memes coming. We do love them and appreciate them.
Yeah, keep them flowing. We can't get through the day without them.
Yes. Okay, well, Mike, good times. Thanks for doing this.
Good times.
All right.
Guess there's nothing else left to say except stay tratty.